Hello, as this week we come to the second Sunday, or the beginning of the second week of the Lenten season. And the scripture readings this time, the first reading comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verses 1 through 4a, the first part of verse 4. The second reading is from the second letter to Timothy, chapter 1, verses 8b through verse 10. And the gospel comes from the tradition according to Matthew, chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. Now, traditionally on this, I mean in more recent times, this second weekend of Lent, the gospel focuses on an event in Jesus' life which we know as the Transfiguration. We, in the Catholic tradition, observe this, as I say, on this Sunday or weekend. In many of the other Christian traditions, the celebration of the Transfiguration of Jesus turns out to be the last weekend of the Epiphany season. In other words, just before Lent begins, they observe the, manifestation. Hence, remember, that's one of the ideas of Epiphany, manifestation of Jesus in all his glory as being called and honored by God. So there's a little different tradition in the Christian churches. If you belong to one of those this weekend, that would be the gospel, that would not be the gospel, that you would hear. Also developed within the liturgical calendar of the Catholic Church, the 6th of August is observed as the Feast of the Transfiguration of Jesus. So this particular event in his life is observed at different times. All right, so that's a little bit of a historical background of how this particular text and the story is remembered not only in Matthew's gospel, but also in that of Mark and Luke. Not, however, in the tradition according to John. Jesus, as we have noticed on a number of occasions in the Matthean tradition, and let's go to this episode, it is pictured as Jesus is making his journey toward Jerusalem as going up a mountain. Now, I started to say that what is often the pattern used by the Matthean tradition is to picture Jesus as the new Moses. So events that occur or took place in the life of Moses are often mirrored in the life of Jesus, and even that Jesus is pictured as, if Moses was great, of course, Jesus is a little bit better. All right? So what are some of the characters? And it's important to notice that Matthew uses events in the Hebrew tradition which reflect the life of Moses. Hence, Jesus is somehow not unaware of the consequences of his action in going up into Jerusalem. So why is this particular event recorded in the Matthean and Synoptic tradition? Some others, although there's a great kind of dispute among scholars about this, think that the Transfiguration story really belongs in the resurrection collection. And you could kind of see how they might make that connection. Jesus is seen glorious, kind of lifted. Well, again, just that you know, there's a kind of discussion or dispute among scholars as to exactly where this particular episode remembered in Jesus' life should be included. Only Matthew, so now let's focus in on the tradition that we're looking at this time, refers to the experience that Jesus and the disciples have as a vision. And this leads them into what we would call today an alternate status of consciousness of life. Visions in the ancient world were normal experiences common to many. It was the way in which information was conferred. One remembers earlier on in Matthew's tradition that Joseph, when in the opening 2 chapters, is having concerns about the relationship that he has with Mary, in a vision, so there's the term and there's the understanding, is told by God, and you know how that unfolds. So visions or dreams in this world are normal experiences common to a majority of people, not only within the Hebraic tradition, but across the board in other also religious traditions. So what we are kind of suggesting here is Jesus is experiencing an alternate state of consciousness. And also, Peter, James, and John are participants in this experience, during which they gain a clearer and closer understanding of Jesus as the one who lives on the brink of all time, but still remains a position of favor with the Father. So what one might see, and remember, of course, without reviewing the whole narrative here, they go up the mountain, they see Jesus in a new light, and they also experience Elijah and Moses. Important to notice even here that when the word is given, Moses is named before Elijah, thus illustrating the importance of Moses. Moses, of course, connected with the law, Elijah with prophets. So we're not quite sure what they're talking about, but we do know that they are present with Jesus in this experience. What the 3 disciples see in Jesus, in the glory that belongs to him as the Son of the living God. The words that are spoken out of the clouds, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Matthew adds some words. Now, those words were heard when Jesus had come out of the Jordan at the time of his baptism. What he adds here, as this vision takes place, is listen to him. So, and of course, that would be in consistency with the understanding that Matthew frequently develops of Jesus as the great teacher. So see how all of the kind of elements of style and literacy blend together as Matthew unfolds this story. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." All right. Now, they are asked to attend carefully to what Jesus has been saying and will continue to insist upon in the days ahead, namely that Jesus is destined to suffer and to die in Jerusalem, and that those who would be his disciples must be prepared to go along the way with him. So in that sense, this is kind of a premonition story, encouraging at least these 3 and perhaps the others to stay with Jesus, but to know that the road and the route that they are taking is not maybe the one that they had initially planned. Remember that preceding this, although we don't hear it this time, Jesus had said to his disciples, we're going up to Jerusalem, and there he will be handed over to the leaders, will suffer, die, but on the 3rd day be raised. All right, so although that's given, they don't quite understand that, understandably don't understand that. So that kind of is the first part of this vision. the four of them, but the six of them are involved in. Three, Moses, Jesus, and Elijah, Peter, John, and James. All right. Now, Peter is pictured as saying, let us put three tents here, one for you, one for Elijah, and one for Moses. Much discussion takes place as to the meaning of what these three tents are. Scholars are not quite sure what references Matthew may have in mind when he mentions these three tents. Of course, easy enough, because we like the number three. Well, one for each of them. Do the tents refer to, in some way, the idea of the temple? That in the wilderness years, the Israelites had lived in tents. And therefore, as they moved through various different parts of the Sinai, had to undo their tents and then put it down. Keep in mind, too, the wilderness years of the Israelites were not moving every night or every week by taking their tents. Also, you have to understand, I don't know what your viewpoint of a tent is. Perhaps you were a Boy Scout or something, Girl Scout or something like that, and you had your own idea of the tent. But these tents that the nomadic shepherds used were wide, long kind of structures in which a number of people could live. They often did not have closures, although they could, and therefore they would be built in the direction that would be furthest away from any possible desert disturbances. So all of that, I give you a little quick review of the tent used by particularly the shepherds, but also even to this day in some parts of Israel, living in tents is part of some of the nomadic shepherds. So if you have an opportunity when you visit the Holy Land sometime, you might go out into the desert area and see if you can find some of these wandering shepherds and go into one of their tents. Just an observance of that kind. So, as I say, we don't know, scholars are not sure what the use of the tents are. Of course, it could be some allusion to one of the three major feasts of the Israelite community, observed even in Jesus' time, called the Feast of the Tabernacles or the Feast of Tents, in which the Israelites in Jesus' time often lived for a week in some kind of tent structure, remembering these wandering years of the Hebrew community. Even today, in some Jewish homes, during the Week of Tabernacles, they kind of remember this particular style of living. Now, whether that is part of all of this is certainly another question. Really, we're not sure what the tents mean. But through this vision, the three disciples are invited to understand a little bit better and deeper the meaning of Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, and also encouraging them to be part of this and to understand what would be happening. And by seeing Jesus here in the glory that is given him by the Father, hearing again the words of the Father, are reassured that despite the difficulties and despite the misunderstandings of what a Messiah should be like by many, they begin to get a different perspective, namely the perspective of the Messiah will be one who will suffer and die for the beliefs that he has taught, and perhaps in some ways also because he has challenged the authorities. All right. So there's a little bit of background with regard to the Transfiguration event. The first reading, as we began to notice last time, are going to choose sections that develop how the story of Israel developed. Last time, of course, the first week, we heard the story of Eve and Adam. This time, in chapter 12, we really are getting only a very short little reminder that Abram, actually in the earlier part of the story, moves from where the story begins, namely in Ur of the Chaldees, to Haran, and then ultimately to sections of Palestine. So it's the story. One way to look at this is the call of Abraham. There's not voices from the heavens or anything like that that indicate his being called by God. But it does seem to indicate that God personally directs Abraham to leave his native land, Ur of the Chaldees. Now, you know where Ur is, a little bit of a geography reminder, was located on the Euphrates River in the southern portion of Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. Now, not only does Abraham move, but also his father and members of his family. They settle in Haran, which is the far north area of the Belek River in upper Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Turkey. So you have to kind of get a map, but follow in a certain way the route from Ur to Haran. And it is from Haran, which turned out to be, in the time that we're looking now, we have a very large period of time to look at. Ur of the Chaldees, and perhaps we could back up there a little bit for a moment, was a Sumerian city-state in southern, as we mentioned, Mesopotamia, and originally was a coastal city on the Persian Gulf. So it was not all inland, but also engaged in trade. As far as we know, the origins of this community at Ur took place somewhere between the year 5,500 and the year 3,800 before the Common Time. It had originally began as a small village and then had grown larger. The story that Genesis might be aware of was the early dynastic period, which was between 29,000 to 2,334 BCE. In those days, the kings of Ur, and it was so important to notice, was a political and religious center, and the king exercised both roles, and the god who was honored there was Nanna, N-A-N-N-A, who was the moon god. A man named Leonard Woley, W-O-O-L-E-Y, his dates are 1922 to 1934, did the first kind of excavations of some kind of Ur, and indicated its importance in the ancient world. Archaeologists continue to kind of do work in that neck of the woods when they can. Of course, unfortunately, there are some political difficulties in that part of the world today. But what they have uncovered is that this was a major city at a certain point in time, and they have discovered I don't know if how it comes across like this, but they have blocks of clay, so written with writing on it, okay? So what some who like this kind of thing indicate that this is the first evidence that we have of a kind of writing outside of Egyptian hieroglyphics, and that there are a number of these, and apparently they were some kind of, at least that's the estimate that those who are trying to read them now, of course you have the difficulty of the language, were some kind of tax records. I know you all would love that at this time of the year. And that they have discovered a number of them. But the indication is that this city, Ur, was very important at a certain period in time. But ultimately, they have uncovered there, for example, the archaeologists, which they call the Royal Cemetery. So they have discovered the remains of important people, they believe, who were buried there. So once again, archaeology doesn't prove anything, but it gives us some insight into the times in which things might well have occurred. So look what we can put together. It was an important city. It obviously was some kind of center. Why did Ur of the Chaldees fall out of, go into almost non-existent? And the theory is that the weather changed, that they got that the lack of water, the ability to grow anything, the ability for traders to maybe find some kind of rest place, all disappeared. And so in the pages or annals of history, Ur will be remembered, but not known too much in later times. So all of that is a little bit of background. This digging up, by the way, of Ur took place in 1929, and they established, this helps us to try to get a basis of time in which Abraham would have moved, and the estimate there is in the 1800, the 1800s, would have been about the time that the movement of the family of Abraham took place. Abraham we don't know much about. He's simply described as an upright man, a man of faith. And before I go leave this whole story of Ur, they also built kind of buildings which were called ziggurats, Z-I-G-G-A-R-A-T, and we have seen pictures of them, and hopefully they might discover them. That would have been the basis, by the way, remember in the book of Genesis, where they are trying to build a tower up to God to reach the heavens. Well, the ziggurat would have been the model that they used. Perhaps we have some pictures of that we could see what a ziggurat looked like. So again, all of that, a little bit of background of the movement of the family of Abraham to Haran. Haran now is, again, far to the north on what is known as the Belek River in Upper Mesopotamia, which, as I mentioned, is modern Turkey. Haran was the place where his father would have stayed. It's also where apparently his brother stayed. And for reasons now that seem to be what God is calling Abram to do, he moves. So keep in mind, you're going this way. He's now going to move south. And Abram comes to three places are mentioned in the reading that we hear this time. His journey will take him to Shechem, will take him to Bethel, and then to the Negev. Now, at both of those two places, at Shechem and at Bethel, Abraham built an altar to God. So in a certain way, a premonition of Israel's being part of this land is already taking place. And then he moves to the Negev, which is the southern part of Israel, which is the desert area. In the verses that we hear, verses 2 and 3, remember we're looking at chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 express 7 blessings. The word blessing appears 5 times, and then there are 2 special blessings. So 7, of course, is the number that we look at frequently in the Bible as the number of perfection. So Abraham is being completely blessed by God as he moves through the promised, what turns out to be the promised land. So Abraham brings with him his nephew, Lot. We will, he takes part in the story. And I think I've mentioned this when we say that Abraham comes with his wife and families. The guy is not just taking with him a suitcase of goods. He is bringing a whole collection of sheep, of other kind of animals, some kind of grain coming with him, a large number of people. So this migration, if you want, of Abraham and Sarah is not just a couple of people or one family, but it's, one family, but it's very numerous in its possessions and in its goods. And perhaps you can kind of see that the migration of Abraham was, and the reason for Abraham leaving seems to be the invitation of God. We don't know, just as I mentioned, what God said or how this would happen at this point in Abraham's story. There will be a number of further episodes. The Abraham story is well documented in the book of Genesis. Abraham is certainly going to be considered as the father of the Hebraic community. And thus, his taking over or settling in the land of of Israel, sets the model that later on the Mosaic movement and when Joshua leads the Israelites into the Promised Land, has always had a precedent. So, all of that is, there's not very much given this time about Abraham, except that why is he a man of the faith? Because in some strange way, which is not narrated in the scripture, he brings his family down into Palestine, and it is the beginning of the exercise of the experience of God's making Palestine the home for the Israelite or Hebraic family. Also, in this little episode that we have, as I just mentioned, Abraham is completely blessed by God. What exactly the nature of these blessings are, we don't know, but just the reference is made there. If Abraham comes there in the 1800s BCE, some possession of the land of Israel certainly is precedented by his being there. However, important to notice, and this is left out, when Abraham arrives in this part of the world, there are already a number of people living there. It isn't that Abraham is moving into a totally uninhabited land, and it may be why he settles a little bit more in the southern part, in the desert period. Well, why fewer settlement? And also because you have all these animals and stuff, there's place for them to roam. When you think of the desert or the wilderness, of Palestine, do not think of the Gobi Desert, but think of a place where there is a little bit of grass, just a little bit for the nourishment of flock. All right, so we have looked a little bit at the background of this time of the second week of Lent. Thank you for being with us and hope to see you again.